Well, it's January 2016, and it's a pretty nasty and rainy day out. Pretty good day to sort of take stock and sort things out and define a direction for the next couple of days in trying to move forward in my small but active saw world. I think the first subject that I have to discuss with these saws is who should consider a saw like this or a project like this. Now, obviously, the first type of person who would be interested is a hobbyist like myself. But these are big saws. These are not toys. But I don't know of any saw in any configuration, aftermarket or OEM, that you can buy to this point in time, or any series of parts that can provide as much raw power and performance as these things do. I mean, these are legitimate saws. They're legitimate 90cc saws or close to 100cc saws if you choose to use the big bore kit. And the quality of most of the parts is more than adequate to do a fair amount of work. They're not going to come apart on you. There's a few things, and we'll get into it as I get through this video, that need to be replaced with OEM. But in large, most of the parts that you can buy from this particular company are very serviceable. The original intent of my videos was to see whether or not aftermarket parts as a concept is a viable approach to extend the life of some of these saws, in particular the steel 066's and 064's and MS660's and the like. And the answer is, oh yeah. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that can really extend the life of that class of steel, and they're legitimate parts. They're not garbage. They're legitimate parts. So, having said that, let me first go through the list of parts that I would prefer to leave OEM if you can afford to do so. And there's not many. And I think that's why I want to cover it, because those who are sensitive to saying things about a particular class of saw or class of parts are you know, they're going to say, oh, you're being negative. No, heck no. These things are awesome. First, and I think we've already said it, is these parts right here. And this is the assembly of parts that are used for the chain adjuster. Just simply the gears, the material in those gears is too soft, and they wear out very quickly. The rest of it, you know, they work, but that crown gear and this worm gear right here, I would definitely advise spending the extra $25 and getting an OEM option for those, because you use it all the time and they wear very quickly. I don't consider that adequate. So when I build these now, I don't use those. Throw them away. Second thing is these clutch drums. They're a little bit of a hit and miss operations. I've found a couple of them so far that were quite out of round. Now, they actually worked, so it didn't keep the saw from running. I would definitely see if I could find an Oregon or different clutch drum for these saws. It's worth it. The saw is worth putting a little extra money in. So far, those two parts. Pull starts. And I don't have a steel reference, but the way they work is there's a little bit of resistance required to pull these plastic pawls into that spring. And it sounds goofy. You hear it. And what I found is oftentimes these nylon or plastic pawls, they don't turn easily inside here. So it takes a longer period of time for that to engage, and then they have to turn out in order to engage the flywheel. I did a short video on this once before. I've been able to make mine work, but this has been a source of aggravation. It was even a source of an entire video. So whereas the housing and even the pull cable and the plastic here is decent, that mechanism there where it just is not. It's not what I want to see for fit and finish, and not what I want to see for feel. But I'm not convinced that the steel OEMs can be any different. I had talked about the Freeport issues with the 56 millimeter big bore, so I'm not going to repeat that. But there's a couple of things that I found with the big bore kits. At the base of the spark plug hole where it enters into the combustion chamber, there's sometimes a little bit of a burr that you have to take out with a die grinder. The other thing I found is it really makes sense to go in there with crocus cloth and break the edges of the ports where they intersect the cylinder wall on the Farmertec ones. Just do it and check for Freeport like I did in my prior video. I've had pretty good luck with them. In addition to the burr on the spark plug hole and having to break the edges of the ports, the stock gasket for the 54 millimeter top end is a little bit too small in diameter for that piston. I went through this in another video, you can go back for that. But yeah, I've had to put a little bit of time into tweaking the 56 millimeter cylinders to make them a viable option as well. Well worth the effort, but it's something you have to consider. You just can't just grab them and bolt them on without a little bit of work. Fuel caps on the tank and on here, if you crank them, they seal, but you do have to crank them. The OEM caps, you can easily do it by hand. These guys here, sometimes you got to put the bar wrench in and give them an extra tweak, otherwise they leak. It's funny because I replaced the fuel cap on the first build that I did. Oh my God, this is about beginning of last year, and the one I got from the dealer was effectively a Farmertec. It happened to seal, and the one I had on there didn't. It's just something to look for. On the big bore, when you put the impulse line onto the cylinder or onto the case, you have to do a little bit more than just push it on. And I don't know why it is, but the 56 millimeter big bore has a tendency to blow that darn thing right off of there. What I did was I was able to put it on with safety wire where I crimped it right there on the 56 millimeter. So again, something to look at or something to look for when you're doing the 56 millimeter version of these. In addition to opening up the stock gasket, taking care of the burr at the bottom of the spark plug hole, is you have to do some additional support right there or clamping right there to make sure the impulse line stays there and doesn't blow right off. What else? Okay, that's it really. I mean, I really haven't seen other things that I dislike. I get annoyed with the decomp because when you push it in, every time you pull that saw over, it pops it right back out. So you always have to reset that decomp if you're going to use it to start it. And with the 56 millimeter version of this saw, you have to use. I can't pull it over without the decomp. It's just got way too much compression. Now, so that's it. Those are the things that have caused me a little bit of consternation. In all the situations, I've been able to come up with solutions relatively easily. The pull start, like I said, I did a video on that. The 56 millimeter, should you choose to use it, this one here is a 54. I worked around that. My 56 millimeter test case has been a great saw. I've had a lot of fun with that. It's already seen a fair amount of video time, and it has no sign. It's showing no signs of slowing down. It's actually getting stronger the more I use it. I really enjoy that saw. Things I like. Geez, where do you really start? Let me roll back a little bit because there's an awful lot of stuff I like that's being sold by Farmertec for the steels. One, all this top plastic is really good, and I've now dealt with it in cold weather, and it's not any more brittle than stock. The reason I started using this, as I had pointed out in one of my early videos, was I have a logger friend who has this propensity of crushing his saws, and to the point where saving him money was doing him a big favor. So the chain brake lever, the handle, top cover, all the plastic, the side cover, all that stuff is really good. And I got to tell you, it doesn't make sense on spending the extra money for a saw that's going to get beat up like that when these Farmertec parts are more than adequate. Now, I've had things like occasionally I had to die grind open the holes a little bit, stuff like that. But in general, they just sort of bolt right on. The fit and finish is pretty good. That also extends things like the muffler and the bucking spikes and all that stuff. It's just, you know, it's good value. They work well. The same goes for the handle fuel tank assembly. That's been quite good, you know. It's interesting to me that the Farmertec or part sold through Hudzel on this class of steel is actually even better than the ones they sell for the Husqvarnas, especially the tank handle. But these parts, stuff like this, you know, when you're doing a project saw and you got to get these little details because you got a saw that was in parts in a box, the carburetor, you know, the filter mounting system, these little detail cover parts like that, they're all more than serviceable. They work just fine. They're a good value for the dollar. You know, at first I was skeptical about these air filters, but I've got a fair amount of time on them. They work good. I mean, you might want to go OEM if you're in a sandy environment where you have to deal with smaller particulate that's abrasive. But for places like where I live, you know, the ones that these guys sell are fine. That covers a lot of good stuff if you think about it. This saw right here, just as an aside, is I'm building two of them in this configuration. And they're going to be a 20-inch bar. One's going to be a lightened bar. This will be Oregon LGX. I'm taking off one of the bucking spikes. Basically what I'm trying to do is make the MS660 a little bit lighter for a more general use saw. And I've chosen to work with the 54 millimeter top ends for that application, just simply because they're easier to work with. They're easier to start. They're easier to live with. If you're interested in how these last in a true production environment, stay tuned because we're going to document some of that. That brings up the next subject, and I started it and then I took a tangent into things I like and don't like, and that is, who is the target market for stuff like this? Who's a legitimate customer? Who's a legitimate person who would actually add value to their life in using these parts? And that's not really an easy answer. There's a few nuances that you got to thread and a few mental gymnastics you got to go through to answer that question. First, as I've already said, I've had just a lot of fun with a series of aftermarket parts. And I've built some very, very capable saws to this point. And I've had absolutely no failures that are significant of any kind. I've had some nuisances that I've discussed, all of them I solved. So for a person like me, and I don't know how you describe me, this is a lot of fun. This is a great series of saws to work on. I do a lot of hardwood, you know, most of it 24 inch, I guess 18 to 24 inch, sometimes larger than that. There's a few times I have to get into the 2 and 3 foot diameter stuff, but these are more than enough saw to handle that, and they're proven reliable to this point in time. Now I've got a year on them. I don't have 10 years, but to this point in time, all the internals are holding up just fine. So for a hobbyist who has a wood lot of the scale that I have, having a couple of these around for jigsaw puzzle saws, you know, one that you use for real and one of them you tear apart and modify, and what a great platform to work with. There's so many aftermarket options that, I mean, these top ends are so inexpensive, under $40, and you get this 54 millimeter top end, and you can try pop-up pistons, you can grind on the ports, you know, there's no risk. So it really allows a person to explore the hobby and explore modifying saws for a whole lot less money and a whole lot less risk than if you were doing on a $1,100 OEM saw. So for that person, these MS660's are perfect. But also that very same mentality, that very same personality doesn't have a problem with having to figure out how to solve the pull start issue, to work around the base gasket issue, to, work inside the cylinder to do the finish work. So those little details that I've run into are really not a liability to me. They don't bother me a bit. For that matter, it's part of the challenge. So in sort of a weird and twisted way, it's almost an advantage I had to debug these things. That has added to my to the fun factor. My God, I've got 4 of them that are running. I'll never wear them out. I mean, when I tore them down, the first teardowns, I mean, there's no sign of wear at all at the rate I'm using them. Now these things, they're wearing as you would expect a saw of this class to wear. So I guess that's the first target audience, a hobbyist with a woodlot who has mechanical skills and doesn't mind, and for that matter enjoys solving small problems, and likes the idea of being able to pull things apart and make modifications and put them back together and not risk $200, not risk taking a production saw and harming it, not risk working on customer saws. You can buy a bunch of this stuff and it's a reasonable amount of money, and you can do an awful lot of exploration and an awful lot of hobby type things with it and have an awful lot of fun. So that's the number one person who's going to like these things. Number 2, and this is where I start getting into territory that's going to be controversial, and that is a dealer who doesn't have access to steel parts. And what I mean by that is you have Husqvarna, Dolmar, one of those type of people, and you have to repair your customers' saws, and occasionally they come in with steel saws. Not that you want to get into the business of doing it, not that you want to make a high volume effort of selling aftermarket parts, but in order to service those guys until they get the right state of mind and buy whatever it is you're trying to sell, you are going to have crash damage. You are going to have wear parts, top ends, and stuff like that. These aftermarket parts to this point in time have been, in my mind, legitimate repair options. As I said, there's some exceptions. For example, I don't think I would take an OEM steel saw and recommend putting on one of these or one of these, and certainly not, the chain adjuster stuff. But a guy comes in with a skidder modified MS660 steel or 064 or even the earlier ones, these side covers, handle, top plastic, all this stuff can, for a reasonable amount of money, allow that repair shop to service that customer with a saw that's functional in the environment that it was being used. For the repair shop who has to support these saws, not that they're going to do major rebuilds, but they're going to do the cosmetics and the top plastic, absolutely, this series of aftermarket parts are legitimate replacement parts and repair parts in that environment, in my mind. Now, if you're an OEM steel dealer and you start selling this kind of stuff and calling it OEM, I think that's very dishonest, and I don't think that's something that should happen. If you're a steel dealer and you want to give a log or a low-cost option, and it's defined that way and articulated that way, and they know that what they're getting is not OEM steel, well, that's a legitimate option as well. So for repair parts, I guess I'm not talking about the complete saw, I'm talking about the components I use to build these saws. These parts, especially the outside stuff, are legitimate repair parts in my mind. I'm willing to say that at this point. Who else is going to want one of these things? I think that pretty much sums it up. Who's not going to want one of these things? Well, I guess this goes into the realm of controversy as well. Is to this point in time, I don't know if I would recommend using these as a production saw for a crew, where you're a company, you got a bunch of hired people, you throw a bunch of saws in the truck, and they go out and have right at it, and they really don't have a vested interest in the success of these saws or failure of these saws. So things like the pull start turns into an issue with them because it can be a hassle. That opens you up to complaint and risk. I mean, you're going to get it anyway, but you know, maybe putting OEM pull starts on them or something like that might make it a viable option in those situations. But to this point in time, there's enough little goofy things that you got to play with that the guy who just wants to yank on that cord and go cut wood and make money and really doesn't have patience, and if anything gets aggravated if everything is not just perfect, these aren't for them. And I'll tell you another class that these aren't for, and that's the true steel aficionado, where he's a diehard steel person. These will offend him, and it's going to offend them for a couple of reasons. One, because obviously they're not steel, and you get into that whole philosophy of how these came to be and the intellectual property and all that. Although I don't know that you can make that argument, because aftermarket parts have been sold in the automotive industry forever. So having a legitimate source of aftermarket parts can lower the cost of repairs, and Chevy and Ford and all the rest of them have dealt with it for a long time. And same in the saw industry. But there's going to be those people who are going to be stuck up about steel parts, and these are going to be offensive. So they're not going to be interested in having them. And the other one that's going to be, and the other reason why some of those very same people are going to be upset is how good these things run. I got to tell you, the ones I've got running and I've put together, they're legitimate saws. They're no joke. So, the guy thinks he's going to go jump into a standard OEM MS660 or 066 and go toast one of these aftermarket half-baked saws. Is going to have a big surprise, because these damn things run, and they can be made to run quite well. And a lot of the same things that work on the OEM saws obviously going to work here. But for example, that big bore, you play that game right, and it's going to handily outcut a stocker, without any modifications. And then that gets into what happens if you take an OEM one and mod it to the nth degree, and then one of these to the nth degree. I haven't done that, but I suspect that you might be able to take an OEM further than you can take one of these. That's possible. I would say that an OEM is going to be able to handle more compression because of possibly better plating and things like that inside the cylinders. But that's such a small number of people and such a small number of builds that I think that's kind of a moot point. It really is. So the people who are going to like them are people like me. I mean, I like saws. I'm not as brand loyal. I like my John threads, no doubt. I wouldn't mind having a source of parts like this that worked on my John threads, to be perfectly honest with you, so I could hack and tweak and have more fun with them. Maybe once I have a build concept that works, then I go back and take an OEM cylinder or set of parts and tweak them. But doing the research, I wish I did have that kind of access to parts at this price point. So I don't know if that was a concise or clear thought process about who'd like these, but there's a lot of good things about this stuff, and there's going to be people who like it, and there's going to be people who are going to be upset, and it just depends on where you are in the saw world and what your motivations are and what your likes and dislikes. But the one thing I can say is you can't discount these things out of hand because of lack of capability or quality. Some of the stuff is quite good. Some of it's not the best. Some of it's as good as OEM, some not. But the far majority of the parts that I've worked with to this point in time are serviceable parts that you can put on a saw and expect them to last. They're just not bad at all. I think I beat that to death. I guess I have to always qualify and say, especially with professional saws, OEM is usually the best option. There's no difference here. There's no doubt that if you stack up the parts against the true OEM parts, there may be a statistical error in this, but most of the OEM parts are going to be better than most of the aftermarket parts. So if you want to have the very best you can buy at all times, you know, obviously it's a better idea to stick with OEM. I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that within the tolerances of what's usable, these fit into the to those tolerances, and these are very useful. Cases. These cases, you know, I think I had one that was not perfect. It had some stuff in it, but it was serviceable. They look pretty good to me, and they're holding up, and I haven't had one leak, and I hadn't had one fail. And what a deal. I mean, as compared to the OEM options, these damn things are a great way to start. I haven't seen a problem with these things yet. I really haven't. Nice job. Ignitions. Haven't had a problem with ignitions. Carburetors. That's a bit of a surprise. The carburetors on these damn things work good. I like the 54 millimeter top ends for a repair application better than I like the big bores. I think I made that clear. Just simply because the 54 millimeters, you can just bolt them on, and they will run. And you know, they may be 90% of what a stock is in terms of power and fit and finish, but that's good enough in a lot of cases. So, yeah, I don't mind seeing people buy into these. Yeah, and statistically, like anything else, you're going to find some of the aftermarket parts that have manufacturing flaws. It's just simply statistics. I have to tell you something. I got into a brand new late model Husqvarna and found out that the plating on the cylinder was not complete. So even with OEM, you're going to have a statistical chance of having parts that are not perfect. So, you know, the argument is that at the aftermarket, the statistics are higher than OEM. Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, you're going to see problems on both. So now to the 54 millimeter. There is absolutely no problem with Freeport like the big bores. That's the longer piston skirt. We went through that. Every once in a while, I'll see things like the intake port not being totally symmetric. Still runs. Decent parts other than that. Now, oil pumps. I haven't had a failure with the oil pump. They pump quite well. So I'll transition away from this part of the discussion and into build tips, because there are some things that I've learned that I think are definitely worth passing on. I, in a prior video, showed you how I put the cranks into the cases, so I'm not going to go there, other than to say that when you're pressing those cases together, make sure you're turning that crank so that they work their way through the pre-installed case seals. I usually like to put my seals in afterwards, so I guess it's a legitimate option for you to pop your seals out and put them in afterwards with new seals. But, you know, if you use a little common sense and a little care, you won't have to. Just, you know, having that crankshaft rotating as it's coming through that seal is a good option. There's been some mystery plastic parts from time to time, you know, and at first it's hard for you to figure out where they go. For example, something like this. Oop. Where does that thing go? And it goes underneath the top cover. So that top cover, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that piece of plastic at all. Nothing that I can see to this point in time. You know, maybe in 2 years they get weathered a little bit, I'll have a different opinion, but to this point in time they're fine. These little things, they go right there. I stared at that thing for a long time before I figured that out. So that's mystery piece of rubber number one. Number two. See it right there? And underneath this oil pump, there's a little donut that you got to put in there. When you're doing these worm gears for the oil pump, this is from a Husqvarna. You pretty much have to do the same thing, assemble them the same way for the steels. You know, Just to give you the way they go on like that. I'm going to actually use a vise to put those on. They're not easy to pop on. When we start talking about potential modifications, I'm going to see this thought in there. A couple things came to mind. When I've measured the squish on these stock 54 millimeter top ends, they come in around 30 thousandths. That's pretty good for a as bought cylinder, whether it's OEM or aftermarket. And what that tells me is these 54 millimeter cylinders might be a candidate for a pop-up. Well, we'll discuss that a little bit later. So that's one area I think there's some hop-up potential in these, is either trimming the base, which actually is pretty easy on these, or even possibly a no base gasket build, which I have never done with one of these. I've only done those with Husqvarna's, to be clear. But if you look in there, the problem I have is the lower edge of the exhaust is. So if I drop that cylinder, that's even lower. So that's the only thing that keeps me back from just having right at it. So that's one area of research for me to do. There's plenty of room to widen the intake. I wouldn't change the duration, but I might change the shape and widen it a little bit on these. So that's an area that we can explore. I think I'm going to stick to widening the intake. Don't want to go crazy, because if you look at the top of the intake, that ring is already beginning to prairie dog there. So I'm not sure I'd go any higher, but I might go wider, and I certainly wouldn't go any lower. It's got plenty of duration right the way it is. Yeah, I think that cylinder's going to come right back off.